Francis has worked up and down the California coast, from Washington State way down to Ojai, doing rituals of initiation which do not occur just on a weekend or a Friday and Saturday, but over a year of returning and returning and returning, teaching, till finally the work can happen. He leads gratitude rituals. He's been doing this for years with a big community before Thanksgiving. But gratitude of a scale you cannot possibly imagine. You'll have to ask him about it. He lives in Forestville, California, in the forest, in the Russian River watershed. He knows the plants and the trees and the birds all around him. Astonishing. Ask him about it sometime. Wild turkeys, walk regularly across his land. Astonishing. He is a Hillman, a James Hillman scholar. And James Hillman once said, the first symptom of the loss of soul is the loss of the sense of beauty. Francis has mined that one deeply. So, no more words. Francis, let's take it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. Thank you for having me. It was an interesting trip out here. When I was invited a couple weeks ago to be here, I went to the website and looked to see what the theme was for the year, and this dark talk with screeching pines, and the relationship between the human and the more than human world that David Abram speaks a lot about. So I'm flying out here. I'm sitting between two people. On my right is a young man who immediately put his earphones in and was watching the latest Star Trek movie on his iPad. And to my left was a young woman who immediately went to her iPod and plugged it in and then went to her Kindle. And I'm writing in my notes, flying in a jet at 32,000 feet to come to talk about the disconnect between the human and the natural world. I noticed a little irony in my experience there, but but here I am in Minnesota. I was raised in Wisconsin, so the landscape feels very familiar. It was very sweet to feel that, and the humidity. Well, I don't miss the humidity, but it's good to be back. So I want to talk a little bit about this relationship between the human and the natural world, and particularly the way that grief has filtered into that relationship. I do a lot of grief rituals, as Doug said, up and down the coast of the West Continent. And everywhere I go, this theme of earth grief, as Charles Glendinning calls it, keeps arising. And if we pay any attention at all, we are suffused with the sorrows of this planet. The problem is that we almost are always invited to face that grief alone. And we can't. So we turn away. And we experience what I call the two great sins of the culture, which is amnesia and anesthesia. We forget and we go numb. And these are the two strategies that kind of wrap itself around us as a people. We forget and we go numb. We forget, as Daniel Quinn calls us, we live in the time of the great forgetting. And Doug just mentioned my affinity for Hillman's thought and his whole idea about beauty and aesthetics. Well, if you look at the word anesthesia, it is anesthetic. It's without beauty. We have gone into a culture now without beauty. And Hillman had a phrase once. He said, beauty is an epistemological necessity. It is the means whereby the gods touch the senses, reach the heart, and attract us into life. So without beauty, what is it that attracts us into life? What is it that reaches the heart? What is it that quickens the senses? And so we go anesthesia, we go numb. So these are the two major sins that we really have to be mindful of every single day. Even as Will said, even the food puts us to sleep. The food numbs us. So I'm way off my talk already, so that's just the way it goes. The title of this talk was A Beautiful and Strange Otherness. A beautiful and strange otherness. And the passage comes from a quote of Paul Shepard. How many of you are familiar with Paul Shepard's work? A handful of you. I would highly recommend you read the works of Paul Shepard. Coming Home to the Pleistocene, a beautiful, beautiful book. The Tender Carnivore and the Sacred Game. I won't go into much more thoughts of Shepard's, but the passage I'm using this quote from, he was interviewed for a book called Talking on Water by Jonathan White. And the quote comes after a question that White asks him. He says, so tell us about the role that the others played in the shaping of our humanity. And the others that he's referring to are the creatures, the trees, the rivers, everything that is more than human. And Shepard said, the grief and sense of loss that we often attribute to a failure in our personality is actually a feeling of emptiness where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered. Isn't that stunning?
One more time.
Wouldn't you like that to fall off your lips sometime? I'll say it 3 more times. He said, the grief and sense of loss that we often attribute to a failure in our personality is actually a feeling of emptiness where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered. One more time. The grief and sense of loss that we often attribute to a failure in our personality is actually a feeling of emptiness where a beautiful and strange otherness should have been encountered. Now, in Shepard's mind, this beautiful and strange otherness was meant to be encountered every day, not once in a while on vacation to Yellowstone, or, a walk in the park. But this beautiful and strange otherness was meant to be a companion to our life. And when that companionship erodes, when it is disrupted by domestication, by our living more towards modernity's standards than by the design of our own being, we lose this continuity of connection to the otherness. And what ensues in Shepard's language is an emptiness. How many of you have felt empty from time to time? Nobody, huh? And how many of you blamed yourself for this emptiness? Yes. I mean, Shepard was wise enough to attribute that recognition that we typically blame ourselves for this emptiness. But what if this emptiness is the absence of birdsong? What if this emptiness is actually the failure to encounter the echo of what it is we expected to encounter? And so that emptiness is actually a reminder. It's actually the attempt of our own soul to call us back. Blake once called that feeling divine discontent. And when we ascribe it to some failure in our personality, we typically then turn towards ourselves and we undertake this prolonged and protracted effort to somehow fix and solve the interior problem, when what is waiting for us is this beautiful and strange otherness. You get what I'm saying? So part of what we're struggling with is, what we're left with is the grief and sense of loss. And we don't even know what to ascribe it to. We have this kind of chronic feeling of sorrow that walks with us through our daily life, and we really don't even know what it's about typically. Sometimes, in my book, I read about the 5 gates of grief. And the third and fourth gates we rarely ever even acknowledge. The third gate is the sorrows of the world, and the fourth gate has to do with what it is we expected and did not receive. R.D. Lang said we arrive here as Stone Age children. We are wired and prepared to participate in everything our deep time ancestors experienced. That's why when you arrive here, something feels familiar. Because we're back in the context that the soul expected to be in every single day. See, this beautiful and strange otherness was not just to be the fox in the woods or the pileated woodpecker we saw yesterday, but in each other's eyes. There's supposed to be a beautiful and wild, strange otherness in your eyes that I see that reminds me of my own wildness. You get what I'm saying? Otherwise, again, we typically go back into that state of amnesia and anesthesia, and we greet each other in that state. And we are tamed, and we are dulled, and we occupy a world that loses its luster and its shimmer. And then it's easy to be allured by television and film. But we lose this. We lose the scintillating world of the green and the blue. As Rilke reminds us, not to be cut off, not through the slightest partition separated from the law of the stars. He says, the inner, what is it, if not intensified sky? Hurled through with bird song and deep with the winds of homecoming. Not to be separated, not through the slightest partition separated from the law of the stars. But we live very separated from the law of the stars, whether we know it or not. Our conditioning in this culture separates us from the law of the stars. So we were designed to be embedded in what cellist Glendinning calls the primal matrix, which was the original matrix out of which our species evolved over hundreds and hundreds of thousands of years. And in that matrix, we were kin with the rest of this, the breathing world. We were not alien or other or separate from that world. We were embedded, entangled, commingled with everything that lived. And out of that came our imaginations. See, part of what happens when we separate, Thomas Berry says we have entered a state in which we have become autistic to the world. Isn't that a shocking thought? That we've become autistic to the world. That we don't register its many-chorused song. The swish of salmon tail has disappeared. You know. And this silencing of the languaged world, correspondingly, Berry says, results in a dulling and a thinning of our own imagination. He said the depth of our imagination is correspondingly reflects the complexity of what it is we occupy. So if we only occupy microchips and screens in front of our eyes, our imaginations become correspondingly dimmed. So we need the verdancy of what it is we walk upon when we're here. Miguel took me out to meet the lake yesterday. We need that. We need to look out and see that type of beauty touching our hearts, attracting us into life, as Hillman says. So if we imagine, for instance, this 100 feet long length of rope, which is that about the length of this room? Probably a little longer than that, huh? The first 99 feet and 2 inches is humanity's relationship to nature, unmediated by agriculture or civilization. That was our home. The last 10 inches are since agriculture arrived about 10,000 years ago. The last 3/4 of an inch since the Industrial Revolution. The last sliver of an inch since the information age. We call this normal. We call this little thin sliver of existence normal. When what our inheritance is, our soul inheritance, is this vast matrix of participation in the world. And that is part of what our grief is. We miss the world And the world misses us. And part of what has happened in Western psychology, as Hillman was very keen to point out, is that we've internalized psyche. Psyche now somehow dwells in us, rather than we dwelling in psyche. And correspondingly, as Western religious thought has taken over as well, we have become so privatized and interiorized in our introspection. And Hillman says, the more that soul became interior, the more the world lost soul. So we no longer look to the world for our ensouling encounters. We look internally. And as we've gone more and more internally, the world has gotten colder and less occupied by our minds, our hearts, and our bodies. That make sense? Yeah, okay. Now I want to talk a little bit about what this does to our sense of identity. When we are fully participating in the living cosmos, our identity, well, let me just put it this way, if we had we don't. We come out of mystery. I don't know where the hell we come from, but we come from some mystery. We arrive into this coat of skin and bone and blood, mind and heart. And that body is the first encounter with participation. But the body, our experience of birth, arrives us into the second round, which is family. And in a healthy culture, in a healthy cosmos, that family is embedded in the community. In a healthy community, that community has circles of spiritual obligation and responsibility called clan life. And why do you think we have clans when we come here, huh? There's an intuitive, instinctive knowing that that's a necessity to have clan life. When the clan life is functioning, they become the bridge between the community and the cosmos. That's their job, to keep the flow of sacred energy moving back all the way down. Now that is actually our identity. I am body, family, community, clan, cosmos. That's me. We have lost cosmos by and large. Clan life, it does not exist. Community has become abstraction and rhetoric. We talk a lot about it. Families are often isolated, fragmented, and broken. Typically, all we end up with is this. And we wonder why we feel so alone and so grief-stricken and so isolated. We've lost 4/5 of our identity. We've lost 4/5 of our sense of self. This is a tremendous loss that we don't even know how to name. We didn't even know that that was what our birthright was, to live with that grandeur. We were walking, we went over to the site last night after hours and spent some time with the buffalo head and the bear spirit. And we were walking back, and I said, and the night sky was beautiful. And I said, in the Middle Ages, they tried to come up with an image to depict the grandeur of the soul. And the image they came up with was the night sky. That's how big we are. That's how beautiful and mysterious and unfathomable. That's us. And we usually end up slouching towards mediocrity at the height of our life. So this is the grief we carry. It's in our bones, it's in our hearts, it's in our minds. Even Freud said, originally the ego includes everything. Later, it separates off an external world from itself. Our present ego feeling is therefore a shrunken residue of a much more inclusive, indeed all-embracing feeling which corresponded to a once intimate bond between the ego and the world about it. What happened? If that's what we entered into, what happened to sever that bond? And I don't know about you, but I don't want to be a shrunken residue. I didn't come here to be a shrunken residue. I came here for the whole expanse of life. And in my 30 years of working with people, My sense is that one of the deepest depressions we carry is a diminished sense of participation for our soul in this lifetime. That's one of the deepest depressions we carry, is a diminished sense of participation for the soul in this life. I mean, the image we're given is to, get a job and earn a living, watch TV. When I was in Maladoma's village in Africa, every night at dusk, the commons would swell with people and bring food and millet beer, and there was laughter and arguments and stories being told, and the kids would be running around until they got so tired they'd lay down and fall asleep on the ground, and I didn't know which child belonged to whom until they picked them up at night. And if a child was nursing, they could go to any mother with milk and be nursed. I have never felt such envy in my entire life. And then I realized this is when we have happy hour in our culture. It's as if that's our secondary satisfaction. That's as if we will try to, again, anesthetize the fact that at this time when we're going home, we should be going home to 40 or 50 more pairs of eyes, and not to my TV screen or to my, even my small family isn't enough. Part of the reason why we're so disappointed in our marriages is that you're not 40 different women. You're only one inadequate woman or one inadequate man. We expected so many more eyes looking back at us and get the full arc of what the masculine looks like and the full arc of what the feminine looks like. But we're given this thin, little, isolated encapsulation called a nuclear family. We should have gotten a clue from the beginning that was not a good idea. Nuclear things don't do too well, Oh, yeah. So this amnesia and this anesthesia lead to what I call the great emptying. This great forgetting and this great numbing lead to the great emptying. And we are seeing the world emptying. This is, again, part of the grief we have to, as mature men, turn our face into, that full wind to acknowledge the sorrows of the world. Every 3 weeks, a language is silenced. And with it, an island of imagination and encounter with the sacred. Nuanced sense of medicine coming from plants. An intimacy with land that is forever gone. And we are slowly encroaching upon every corner of this planet with our Western monolith and our monotheism of economics as our dominant way of relating. And I saw that you quote John Stokes on your newsletter webpage. And I heard John say this exact quote back when I met Doug in '87. He said, what we don't talk to, we don't understand. What we don't understand, we fear. And what we fear, he said, then we destroy. So what we don't talk to, we don't understand. What we don't understand, we fear. And what we fear, we destroy. And that's very easy to see culturally. What we don't talk to. We don't have conversation with other cultures. We typically fear them and then we destroy them. But the same thing happens between our relationship to this living planet. We've stopped the conversation. The conversation has all but ceased between the human and the more than human world. David Abram also said that we are human only in contact and conviviality with what is not human. I love that he chose conviviality. In other words, we have to have a living, embracing, intimate relationship that has some quality of communion in it. Conviviality, convivium, the gathering, the place of meeting to converse, to bring the conversation back into our life with the world. So the big question for us right now and for every day is, how do we begin to restore the relationship to this beautiful and strange otherness? Does that seem to be a core question that we're sitting with? A few years ago, I took a class in flint knapping, making arrowheads out of obsidian and spear points in Point Reyes in California. And the course was taught by a man named Bill Molloy, who was a fantastic lithic expert, an anthropologist, and we watched him with great admiration as he would look at a piece of obsidian and then with a hammer stone flake off these beautiful blanks that within a couple of minutes he would produce these beautiful points. Then it was our turn, we put on the big goggles and the big gloves and smashing obsidian like crazy. But every once in a while a piece would flake off. But what happened for me was this. I recognized this movement. It was in my body. I started thinking about the movements that made us human. We've been doing this motion for 2 million years, flaking stone. This movement is in my body. It's in your body. When we gather in the morning to sing, that movement is familiar. Our ancestors made cordage. I started making cordage out of dog bane. That movement was familiar. And then I started wondering what happens when the movements that made us human are no longer enacted. It's as if some portion of our psychic life, or even our mental life, our minds, don't get activated. You know what I mean? So these movements have to be recovered. The good thing is that we're wired for them. Everything that we need, we're wired for. We just have to remember what are the movements that made us human. There's something about, again, gathering like this around fire, around story, around song, around ritual, around sharing food. These are the movements that are familiar and made us human. And when we participate in them, we remember who we are. We come back into the circle of life. So the first thing I think we need to do is slow down. I was licensed very young. I don't know why they gave me a license at 27, but they did. It's their fault. But I was smart enough to know I didn't know shit about sitting with people. So I apprenticed myself to a beautiful old man who was 60. He was so old. He must have known something at that age, So I sat with this old man. And the very first thing we shared, he sat down and we sat face to face, and he reached over and he patted this big rock that he had by his chair, and he said, "This is my clock. I operate at geologic speed. And if you're going to work with the soul, you need to learn this rhythm, because this is how the soul moves." And he pointed to a clock and he says, "It hates this." Whoa. I tell every single person I work with in my practice that story, because every one of them is in a hurry to change. And underneath that hurry to change is a fear that if I don't change, I won't be let in the circle. If I don't change, I won't be let in the circle. I won't be welcomed. There's this urgency to fix ourselves because of this chronic anxiety we carry about being outside the circle, about not being welcomed. And that's another part of what happens when we lost that matrix of welcome and belonging. We carry a chronic anxiety of whether or not I'm going to be good enough to measure up, to fit in. And so I try to disabuse everybody I work with. I say, I have no interest in improving your life. I have no interest in fixing your problems. All I want to do with you is help you listen more deeply to what your soul is actually asking of you to live this life more fully. And the symptoms that brought him in the room, whether it's depression or addiction or anxiety, that's the grace. That's what got them in the room. That's not the problem. The problem is a dissociated relationship to their soul, which is by and large how we are conditioned to live in this culture. So all praise to my mentor, Clark Berry, who taught me how to slow down in the room. And I think that's also what we begin to approach. By the time we leave here on Sunday, you'll notice your whole body is moving very differently. Maybe even your speech slows down. Maybe your mind quiets a bit because we come back into geologic time. We're back in the indigenous soul's rhythm. Malidoma once said to me, he said, your culture is very much in danger because it is beginning to match the rhythm of the machine. Because whatever you associate with, you begin to match its rhythm. And so the danger is that if we're not spending enough time in the rhythms of nature and in the rhythms of community, we are very prone to begin to match the rhythms of the machine. And we are a frenzied culture. We're a culture addicted to speed. I mean, we want everything fast now. Even the food, right? Well, we want fast food. We want fast computers. We want fast cars. We want fast communications. We want it instant. But the whole idea of slowing down is anathema to this culture. But if we're going to, again, like Clark said, if we're going to know the soul's rhythm, we have to learn that speed. We have to come back into geologic time. So grief work. Okay. So I think it is our deep, sacred obligation to become familiar with the rites and practices of grief. I can't think of a more necessary move that we could do than to be willing to register the losses and sorrows of the world. Because if we don't, what happens? If we don't register those losses, in some way we are tacitly in agreement with the process. In a sense, our capacity to grieve is really a reflection of how deeply our love has entered the world. Think about that for a moment. Our capacity for grief is really a reflection of how deeply our love has entered the world. We can grieve deeply for things close into us. If we lose a child or a relationship or a parent or a friend, we feel that grief intensely because our love has gone that far. But when it goes farther than that, our grief becomes a little bit more diminished. And then I read about the Awa people in South America who are willing to put their lives on the line. They were willing to die because of what Chevron and a few others are trying to do to their land, because their love is commingled with the jungle. Their love is infused in the place. We need to be able to love the land and the place as deeply as we love our partners. See, our love is not meant to congeal at the backbone of our partner. Our partner is meant to be a window through which our love falls into the world. You get what I'm saying? That's only meant to be a quickening of love, not an end to love. So the thought is that when love is quickened or stirred in us by another human being, they become the invitation to love what stands behind them. Any thoughts about that? Does that make sense? What behind them is huge. Yes. Yes, the blue of the sky, the honeysuckle, the frogs. Everything stands behind them, the stones. Our love is meant to pour out. Robinson Jeffers says we are meant to fall in love outwards. So our love is meant to just pour into the world.
If you're trying to find the source of a transmission, you need two radios to triangulate. With one you can get the distance, with two you can triangulate and find the location. He says that two people in a committed relationship can triangulate towards God.
Beautiful. Exactly. Right on. Yeah. Yeah, right on.
And that big thing out there is always welcome. It's the circle.
Yes, it's always welcoming and waiting. Waiting. Waiting.
In front of you all the time.
Correct. Correct. Yeah. But in our busyness, we forget to notice. The Chinese spell busy with 2 ideograms, heart killing. Isn't that astonishing? Heart killing. That's how they spell busy. And we pride ourselves in our busyness. It's the busy person in our culture that's admired the most. The other people are called what? Lazy, lazy, yeah. We want to be busy people. We want to show that we're actually being productive. We're earning our living, which I think is one of the most obscene phrases in our culture. To earn a living. I mean, this isn't a given. I have to earn this. So we need to find, again, ways to slow down. And one of the things that we can do is honor grief. Grief slows us down, brings us to our knees, drops us into a very low place. Even the word grief comes from gravis, which means heavy. That's where we get gravity, grave, and occasionally we meet someone with gravitas. Someone who has faced that sorrow. Someone who has walked through that time. In the Scandinavian cultures and many other cultures too, I think first heard this from Robert Bly back in the 80s. He said when somebody in that culture was dealing with loss, they would live along the fire pits in the longhouse. They would live along the ashes. And they would be living in the ashes. And nothing would be expected from that man or woman for a year. Because they were doing their sacred duty, which was to mourn. We're given about, a day for the funeral. Maybe you get a week off for bereavement leave, and then right back at it. So we have an entirely insane culture. In fact, speaking of insanity, the latest DSM-5 has come out, the Diabolical and Statistical Manual of mental disorders. And I have a friend who's a psychiatrist, and he said the first edition of this, the first, what do you call it? Threat? Draft, that's it. Threat 2, I think, is right. The first draft of this was going around to psychiatrists in England and in America. And they were trying to have grief re-described as you're given 2 weeks to grieve. And after that, you must be classified as major depressive. And so, what's that? Major depressive, I think. And so, they fought it terribly, and they got 4 weeks. So we can already leave. Here we are. So we've got 4 weeks of, to grieve. But beyond that, and then take a pill. So you can't prescribe for grief. There's no pill for grief. But beyond that, you can prescribe a pharmaceutical for that. So we don't know who's behind that. Yeah. So Denise Levertov has a sweet little poem about our grief work. She said, to speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. To speak of sorrow works upon it, moves it from its crouched place, barring the way to and from the soul's hall. So unless we speak of our sorrow, we begin to have this congestion in the soul's hall. We can't get to our soul, and much less the soul of another, until we become fluent in the language and customs of grief. And very few of us are fluent in that language. In fact, most of the times when I encounter somebody approaching their grief, they don't just experience grief, they oftentimes experience what I call grief terror. They don't typically, at minimum, it's grief anxiety. You know what I mean? In other words, grief is no longer just its own expression. It comes with this ancillary experience of fear. And partly because most of us had the experience of not having our grief met. I mean, Miguel said last night that we've rarely had the opportunity or the experience of being protected. I would say we've often rarely had the time of being accompanied in our emotional life. You know what I mean? In other words, when we have experiences like grief, and we come into the house after the first crush ends in disaster. Anybody had that happen? Yeah. A few of you. And that, our heart is broken. And we come in the house and we don't know how to speak about it. If we do, sometimes we get teased or ignored or put down or dismissed. And so in a sense, our grief is never given a bottom. We don't know we can fall fully into grief's room and trust that there's a floor. Typically when we approach that room, it feels like if I go there, I'm going to be free fall. So we are terrified of going into the place of grief. So part of what I appreciate about these conferences here is that you have been practicing putting a floor underneath your grief, beginning to trust it again, beginning to have faith that it is some place you can walk into fully with full courage and full willingness to express that emotion and be caught. Do you get what I'm saying? Does that make sense? So any thoughts, any questions coming up? Yeah, back there.
Do you think that the fear of it in the culture has to do with the idea maybe that there is no bottom? And so people don't want to go there because they feel that there's just no bottom to the grief?
Well, I think two things happen. One of them is that we are asked to face this grief usually privately, which is terrifying. So there's two things to let go of grief. There's two requirements. There's containment and release. And if I'm carrying my grief privately, containment will always win out. And so in a sense, what we're doing is recycling grief. You notice you're still chewing the same bones, oftentimes year after year, and they're grief bones. There's nothing left on them, but you're still chewing on them. Partly because we're still waiting for that signature response that all I have to do now is release, because the containment is there. The container becomes the bottom. The emotion of it, when we begin to have faith in grief, when we begin to have enough experience in that territory, we know there's no bottom. There's no end to it. Grief does not end. I remember this man, I was giving a talk in Southern California, and he was an Austrian man whose wife had just died a few weeks ago. And about halfway through the talk, he says, "So, what is the 1, 2, 3 of grief? I want to be done with this. What's the 1, 2, 3?" And in fact, he was so afraid of his grief. When he began talking about it a little bit in the room, he said, "A friend of mine died." He couldn't get that close. He couldn't let it quite get that close. It was actually my wife. It was a friend of mine. And another person mentioned to me that was his wife that died. So I thought about his question for a moment, and I said to him, "I can't accept the premise of your question. It presupposes an ending to your grief. It will not end. It will change over time. It will become this bittersweet melancholy that will accompany you forever. But this is your new relationship to your wife. This is how you will walk with her forever now. This is This is how she is. This is the evidence that you chose to love. This is the evidence that you allowed someone to penetrate your heart and take up a dwelling place there. This is the true right of love as well. That love and loss, the first gate of grief is that everything you love, you will lose. That's the first gate of grief. Everything you love, you will lose. So is there an ending to grief? Hell no. But it becomes, is there an ending to grief? No. But it does deepen us. It carves riverbeds in our soul. It has a way of deepening us that no other emotion can. It is the foundation of compassion, is to know loss. You know?
Can I add something? Part of the fear, I think, of grief is that there will be nothing that comes from it. And we don't understand that grief is generative.
Yes. That's right on. Yeah, grief. I think our associations, that's great, Danny. Most of our associations is that grief is kind of a dead zone. It's an empty, flat, dead zone, and there's tremendous vitality in sorrow. Tremendous energy. And the other thing I want to just add to that is William Blake's phrase, the deeper the sorrow, the greater the joy. That we have, since we've kind of lost this lower register, we've also lost the upper register. So we have compressed this zone into we live in basically a flatline culture. And when you live in a flatline culture, you become addicted to stimulants and stimulation. So we need bungee jumping, and we need roller coasters, and we need stock markets, and these things that keep us feeling that we actually have a pulse. Because the true register of life, from sorrow to joy, has been unoccupied. If we want to start an Occupy movement, it's right here. So you had a question.
I had a line that says, there's no bottom to the pit, there's no roof to the sky.
Beautiful.
Say that again? Say that, please. There is no bottom to the pit, and there is no roof to the sky.
Yeah.
The other thing, what I was going to say is that we also feel like we need to be told, when we don't start trusting our instinct to feel, we rely on other people to tell us how to feel, how to think, and how to act. So we totally surrender ourselves to whatever the status quo is, and so the word that I think in Spanish is otorgamos. We give responsibility to institutions to tell us what we feel, and that's like a total, very dangerous territory,
But part of what we're looking for is multiple reflections from the community that this is an emotion that is welcome. And when we live in the flatline culture, we're walking through this amnesia and anesthesia. We're not getting the reflection back that this is part of our life. In the village in Africa, there was a grief ritual happening somewhere almost every single day. And I remember walking up to one woman, I said, "You have so much joy." Because she did. She was just ebullient. And her response was, "That's because I cry a lot." A very un-American phrase, by the way. It's not because I shop a lot or, I keep myself busy. It's because I cry a lot. And that register was wide open. Yeah.
I spent some time in Russia, and Russians are very comfortable with their grief. And for like 50 years we had this Cold War, but I heard, and it's a cliche, but it's an interesting one, the difference between a Russian and an American. An American is a mile wide and a foot deep, and a Russian is a foot wide and a mile deep. Okay. But they really, when you go there and yes, there's a lot of talk about war and stuff like that, but their passion about the grief of loss of life is really very important.
Absolutely. Yeah. Good. Thank you. Yeah. Yeah. AJ.
Yeah. Grief is good.
Grief is good. Amen.
Grief is good.
Amen.
And I think a part of it is the culture I grew up in. Grief equals no control.
Yeah.
And as a Marlboro man, that scares me to death.
Yeah.
See, everything is under my control.
Yeah.
So grief, like I'm not in charge if I go there. Yeah, put that out.
Yeah. Yeah, right. Grief is subversive, undermining the quiet agreement to behave and be in control of our emotions. It is an act of protest that declares our refusal to live dumb and small. There's something feral about grief, something essentially outside the ordained and sanctioned behaviors of our culture. Because of that, grief is necessary to the vitality of our soul. Contrary to our fears, grief is suffused with life force. It is riddled with energy, an acknowledgement of the erotic coupling with another soul, whether human, animal, plant, or ecosystem. It is not a state of deadness or emotional flatness. Grief is alive, wild, untamed, and cannot be domesticated. It resists the demands to remain passive and still. We move in jangled, unsettled, and riotous ways when grief takes hold of us. It is truly an emotion that rises from soul. And you're right. We are dominated by one archetype in this culture, and that's the heroic archetype. And the hero is always in control. Always rising, always going up, always successful. We hate it when things go down. We have entire industries to make sure that things keep going up. You know? We are afraid. We are afraid of the descent. And grief takes us to our knees. It takes us below the ground, into the shadowed territory. Yes?
Francis, when I was 16, my mother died. She came home from work, wasn't feeling well, laid down on the couch. My father was making dinner, and he asked me to go wake her up because dinner was ready, and she didn't wake up. And I didn't cry a tear. You know, people came up, you know, how are you? I'm fine. I'm fine.
Yeah.
You know, is there anything I can do? Let me know. Of course, I never asked for any help. I never did any of that. So I get this Austrian guy, and I don't think it's just the Austrian, it's the Austrian stereotype. It's the Western culture that tells us that that's a thing. You know, that's what the DSM, all these well-meaning professionals, you know, and I know, right? And again, I'm a doctor, like Will pointed out. I get that. It sounds like people are evil trying to do that, but that's the culture. That's what we're taught. Like, okay, it's something, get through it. And then vary with a lot of adverse results, obviously, because that's been something that I get. And it goes through so much of the work that we do here. The problem I see is that it's work that we do here. You know, there's 100 guys here in a country of 400 million people. And there's men's conferences, but so when you go out of these spaces, out of this room, it's really difficult to translate that into real life. You know, whether it's getting time off from work when somebody close to you dies, or whether it's being compassionate or helping people through their times of grief or asking for grief, still it's like, okay, I can come to the men's conference and do some grief work for those 5 days in a year, or I might be able to reach out to some guys who are doing that kind of work, but this whole cultural adversity towards grief and loss and death and all of those things I see as the issue. You know, so again, it's, you know, this Austrian guy, I get it. I know where he's coming from. Like, okay, teach me how to do this, which is in part what I'm thinking as you're up there, like, okay, now you've told us the problem, what's the solution? You know, like, how do we transform this? The problem that I would present is how do we transform this culture? And they spend years since I came. The first time Martine Pertel said, you know, it's about that culture. It's about having a community around you to support you in that grief. Because that alone shit doesn't work.
Yeah. I ask this question almost every place I go, because it is the huge symptom in the culture. What I suggest people to do, most of us have at least one or two friends, right? Hopefully we each have a couple friends. I suggest you call them up and say, on Friday night I want you to come over to my place, or we meet at your place, and we're going to break a taboo. We're going to talk about sorrow. We're going to just sit there and talk about our grief. And there's no need to fix a damn thing. Nothing is broken. But there's something that we have to do, which is break the privatization around our grief. And this culture privatizes everything. We even go to private practice to deal with our grief. What we're waiting for is the communal response, because that's the only signature that the soul will recognize as adequate. because grief has always been communal. It has never been private until now. So part of what I think all of us have to do is call a few people. It doesn't have to be a 100-person gathering doing a massive grief ritual. It is the beginning of the courage to begin to tell our stories. That today, as Neruda would say, today I am sad. Today I am in pain. Today I am in grief. You know?
Can I add something?
Please, Danny.
One of the problems that we have is something that Francis has been talking about today, is this lack of relationship with the world. That the world is alive and actually willing to listen to us. Robert Bringer says that in the modern world, people talk about the world. And in the old way, in the mythological world, people talk with the world.
Mm-hmm.
And it is very possible, and I can tell you from my own experience, to bring grief and sorrow to the world, in your yard,
Yes.
and get a reply.
You give me the 1, 2, 3s of that?
You go, okay, you open your mouth, and you let the sound of your grief come out. Ah! 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 And then you listen with your heart.
We have thank you, Danny. Beautiful. We have just a couple seconds left here. Did you have something, Miguel?
Finish this, but when so let me know.
If we can, we're going to come back to this theme later in the week and keep chewing on this, because it's a thick place that deserves a lot of attention. So maybe we'll come back to this later in the week and do another hour of conversation and dialogue. Okay? All right, so